Hello again, Steve here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about something I'm going to call unlocking the power of morality. And for those who don't like the word morality, you could say constitution in a way, like what's the basis. I would like to think of it in terms you could even talk about the word foundation, right? If you look at the strength of any structure, right? It has to be based on a strong foundation. If the strong foundation is not in place, then the structure is weak. And the bigger and more, robust the structure is, the stronger the foundation has to be. And I want to go on a little bit of a story here to sort of demonstrate where I'm coming from. Okay. Last night I was at an event, and a guy who I know, a very likable guy actually. He's running for politics, and he's running for a far left, radically far left political party. And he gave a very impassioned story about how somebody in his family was had to go through an operation or what have you, and this person was able to access a universal health care system. And had that not been the case, he may have been bankrupt. And so he's in favor of expanding the universal health care to include dental work and I don't know what all else, um, plastic surgery perhaps, and free, so-called free, drugs, pharmaceuticals for everybody. And I had a gave him some feedback on his speech, and I said, you know what, if I was so inclined, I would probably vote for you, but I'm not because I didn't get into the conversation. But the conversation would have gone something like this had there been time and had he had the interest to hear me out. Um, the reason I would disagree with him is because what he's saying is morally wrong, right? Because I would say we don't have a right to universal health care because universal health care is wrong. And you cannot make a wrong into a right. The reason is because in order to have a so-called universal health care system, you have to extort, steal, in other words, known as tax, people who would otherwise not donate to your cause. And that is immoral. It's immoral because the only way that it can be moral is if it's universal, right? And and this is a real challenge, but I hope that you could hear me out because, you know, the power of morality, is the foundation for sustainability, right? And you can see lots of organizations and lots of countries and so on and lots of individuals who, yes, they can prosper and be successful momentarily, but their organizations end by plunging into chaos, into destruction. I mean, as great as Napoleon was and these other Alexander the Great and so on were, their their empires completely collapsed in fairly short order. And we can see this with empires that have lasted a long time based on some form of morality. When they become completely corrupt, they collapse. And you can look at the Catholic Church. When it was more moral, it had a longer staying, more predictability time to it. And when it became very corrupt, you had these fractures that took place with Protestant Reformation and so on. If you can see it right now, it's completely corrupt. They've got an immoral pope, even a very immoral pope, who's and the organization is in complete free fall and will probably fracture into factions, right? So when I looked up the word morality, what I saw was that one of the meanings means conforming to standards, conforming to standards. So what I would say here is that standard means it must be universal. You can't say there's a standard, it applies over here, but it doesn't apply over here. That wouldn't be considered to be a standard. You may find out that one of your so-called standards no longer holds up in with further scrutiny, in which case it would have to be removed from the category of standard, right? So, for example, Christian morality is universal. The Christian doesn't say, "Oh, I will, I can lie to those people, but I shouldn't lie to these people." Certain other religions have non-universal morality, and therefore it wouldn't be morality in this definition. For example, Islam and Judaism, as far as I understand it, they do not have universal morality, and therefore they don't have what would normally be considered standards. Individual people probably do, but the religion itself doesn't, because there's the concept of, in Judaism, you have the Jew and the Gentile. So the Jew can't work on a Sabbath, but the Gentile can. You can get the Gentile to do it. That's not universal. That's us and them. The Muslim will talk about how you can mistreat the kafir, but you can't mistreat the Muslim. Well, that's not universal morality. That's setting up categories there, right? Buddhist, as far as I understand it, they would have a universal morality. When the Buddhist says you shouldn't steal from somebody, he's not saying that you can steal from the Muslim, you can steal from the Hindu over here or whatever. He's saying, no, he's saying that you shouldn't steal, And scientific approach would be, you wouldn't normally use the word morality, but at least science would run on a standard, It's sort of like a universal language. Mathematics is like that. We don't say that 2 and 2 equals 4 over here, but over here it equals 5. No, because we have a standard. It's based on reason. And same with philosophical conclusions. They have to be with a standard. In other words, it has to form some sort of logos or logic. It has to follow, right? And I would say the reason why the West has been so great, and comes back to unlocking this power of morality, the power of the West was largely is based upon moral precepts. People get confused because they see, there was all this colonialism going on and all this immorality in these wars and so on. Yes, all of that took place. I'm not saying it was universally moral, but that wasn't the moral. That was the psychopaths within what's called the West doing up to all these shenanigans. But the average people didn't want it. The average people, the average man and woman, was largely moral, and that was the basis upon which the society became so successful. Because if somebody wants to invest in a business, they want to make sure that not a whole lot of change is going to go on, that it's going to be stolen from them. He's going to be taxed out of his livelihood, that a bunch of people are going to come along and burn the place down. There has to be a predictability, and the morality gives society a predictability. And it's the reason why so much of the world wants to crash its way into the West, because they know it's a better place to live. They have a better quality of life. They're confused about why that is. They think it's because the West stole from them. It's not because of that. It's because the West was largely moral, because it was based on Christian and scientific ethic and philosophical ethic. And another little story has to do with a guy from India I was working with a few weeks ago, and I'd gone to this hardware store to buy some lumber and what have you, and I forgot my screws over there at the store, and so I was telling the guy that evening that I forgot the screws. I had to go back in the morning to get them, and he says, "Oh, they won't be there. Good luck with that," kind of thing. And I went back in the morning, and sure enough, they had set them aside for me, and they had my name on it or something like that. And I told him about that later, and he says, "You know what?" He said, "That would never happen in India. That's only in Canada that would happen." And I didn't get into a discussion about it, but no, it takes place in moral people. And the basis of the West was morality. And the basis of India, from his approach, is not to do with morality. It's to do with what can you get, or what can your family get. It's tribalism, is what it is, as I would say it. And many people it seems like they'd rather be tribal rather than universally ethical. And I think it's because of long-standing traditions. It took thousands of years to develop a universal morality in the West, and that resulted in a scientific process as well, which only came out of the West, largely anyways, somewhat out of China probably. And so I would say in order to be successful, we must be able to hold ourselves. That's where it all begins. Society is built out of the individual people and their behaviors. How the vast majority of people operate is how society is, right? So, but even for ourselves on an individual basis, if we want to be successful in whatever it is that we do, we must be able to hold ourselves to standards. We could call them moral standards, or we could just call them standards. It doesn't matter what we call them. The effect is what it is. For example, we must be honest with ourselves and we must be honest with others. If we want to achieve things in life, so much of what we achieve is achieved through the collaboration with others. And if we're not trustworthy, people are not going to like us, right? They're going to ostracize us. So it's very important. There's a practical reason why these things are important. And it's also a reason why people have stereotypes about certain people. It's nothing to do with racism, as Jesse Lee Peterson talks about. It has to do with their character. And if character traits go through, or if society is built on the individuals, how most people operate, and if there's a certain stereotype about a certain culture, it's because it's based on something. It's not just based on pure bigotry. It could be at times, but a lot of times it's just what people observe. And if they observe that most people in a certain culture are generally honest, then they have a certain attitude towards meeting another one of those people. It's just, it's just like, it's how we operate. We make assumptions based on our past track record. And so we must be able to hold ourselves to certain standards, and like honesty, like conscientiousness. And if we're not conscientious, we won't be able to complete a task, right? And if we're dealing with others, if we're sort of flippantly conscientious, like one day we're conscientious, one day and the next day we're just completely, we ignore everything. We ignore what was going on before. And once again, we will set up a track record, a branding, if you will, of ourselves, which is unpredictable. And that's not good. It's not good for our own success. It's not good for our interactions with others. We must be able to have a standard of do no harm, right? Like, and a way of judging that. The Christians have this old saying. They ask themselves when they get into times of trouble, what would Jesus do? Right? It's like, and Jesus is this embodiment of morality, right? Jesus, for them, is a very powerful figure because he's the guy who is sort of like the trailblazer in how to be moral. I'm not saying that there's examples of him always being that, but that's their approach. And they have lots of stories and so on, their little moral teachings about that. So when they get into a time of trouble, they say, well, what would Jesus do here? Right? And if they get an answer that's confirms their previous understanding of morality, whether it's logical or just emotional or whatever, then they behave accordingly. They're able to make a decision. And as a result, with many, many people doing that, society ends up as very, very moral. I remember this story of that a guy was talking about how in England, where England, the people were very, very moral, very generally the common people. I'm not talking about the royals who are a bunch of psychopaths largely, but who go off in wars and all this sort of stuff, politicians. But the average person was very moral and hardworking and so on. And there was this story of people in a bank lineup, and back in the day when there was actually gold in the bank, and some banker had left a gold coin or a gold bullion or something out on the end of the table. For some reason, somebody had forgot it there, and there was a queue of people lining up to do their banking. And one person picked up they'd never seen that big of a chunk of gold before, and they picked up the chunk of gold, and it created a bit of a stir in the lineup, and everybody was like, hey, can I look at that? And so it went all the way down to the lineup, way down to the door at the end, to the exit door or whatever, and then when everybody finished looking at it, it just made its way back up, and they set it back on the table again. That's an example of very morally, internally controlled individuals who all said, I can't take this because it ain't mine. which is very, very powerful because it's a guiding principle in life and it creates trust, right? My concern is that when we begin to poo-poo all of this, the value of morality, and we say that everybody's system is exactly the same and equally valid, we dilute what took thousands of years to create, and thousands of years to create something that everybody wants in on. And if we don't ask those questions, like this gentleman the other night who was standing up giving this speech about the power of socialism, which is basically stealing from others. He's not from this culture. He's not from that Western culture. He's from a culture of tribalism, where it doesn't matter how you get your resources because somebody needs an operation. Doesn't seem to understand that that system is actually stealing from others. And even if he did, maybe that's fine, because within a tribal system, it doesn't matter about the other tribe. It's all about your tribe. And if to survive we have to steal from the other tribe, that's perfectly fine. That's what socialism is. That's why it's destroying the West. And it's not going to unlock power. It's going to unlock weakness, chaos, and destruction if we allow it to continue. So I think to unlock the power of morality is to be moral ourselves. Think of it in terms of, what can it help me with? You know, to have standards or to have morality of honesty, well, people are going to trust us more, right? If we have morality of conscientiousness, it means I'm going to do what I said I was going to do to the best of my ability. If we have a standard of do no harm, it doesn't mean do no harm just to my family and so on. It means do no harm to everybody, right? And we will have sort of a guiding system, a guidance system. We will have that foundation like the skyscraper. When it's built up really, really tall, it needs to have a deep-rooted foundation in order for it to weather the storms. When we're criticized and when we have troubles in life, when we're in those storms of life, we'll be able to turn to that morality, that standard on how to make our decisions. And that's very, very important, I would say. Steve here again, great chatting. If you like what I'm doing, please like, subscribe, and share. We'll talk again soon. Bye for now.